Throughout my time with the Super Smash Bros. Series, there has been one aspect about all of them that I often find myself looking forward to the most, and that's none other than the stages. Yeah, characters can be really cool, but I've always been equally partial to the variety of stages that are either introduced or returned. Some stages are really cool or play extremely well, ranging from casuals to more competitive. But of course, amongst the many stages that have been in the series for years now, there have also been some that live in infamy, whether it's because of the size or just how they don't seem to work as well as a fighting arena. But there's been one stage that I've always found to be perplexing, as from what I can gather, it doesn't seem to have a clear stance on whether it's an enjoyable or obnoxious experience. A stage that looks really bizarre, and I often think about it on occasion ever since I first saw it. That stage in question is none other than the unlockable melee stage, Poke Floats. I'm sure to some of you, you might be taken aback as to what this even is. And I mean, I don't blame you for it. I literally had a confused reaction myself. But for what seems to be one of the most weird stages in Smash history, also lies a stage with an unexpected origin and conflicted view by general fans on whether it's good or garbage. So in this video, I'm going to be taking a look at Poke Floats, its origins and gameplay, and how it may be one of the most divisive stages in all of Super Smash Bros. Or at least, I think it lies in that field. Let me know down in the comments below if it's even divisive to begin with. So without further delay, let's get started, shall we? I think it's important to start this off with explaining the origins of Poke Floats, because it's not as clear as it may seem. For most stages in Super Smash Bros., they're usually based on an established location set within the universe of the characters that are playable, with only a few exceptions. Some stages are pretty clear in what they're based on, such as Delfino Plaza, Bridge of Eldin, Fountain of Dreams, and many more. Others are more or less based on a central idea that's not tied to a game of origin, like the Pokemon Stadiums and Castle Siege, to name a few. Now, with that said, you may wonder what Poke Floats' origins come from. I mean, it has to at least be based on something, right? Well, that's the thing. Poke Floats isn't really based on anything. In fact, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this stage is the only one in the entire Smash series to not be based on anything that came before it, and before someone comments, know that one episode of the Pokemon anime doesn't count. I highly doubt Sakurai and the team just looked at other medias for inspiration. Interestingly enough though, as I was doing some research into this, I found that in the Japanese version of Super Smash Bros. Melee, this stage is referred to as Pokemon Subspace and not Poke Floats, which means that, contrary to popular belief, the Pokemon shown aren't meant to be depicted as actual balloon floats, and the name for the English release was likely a creative decision and not something like a translation error. So basically, we're fighting on some fucking weird alternate dimension where there happens to be giant floating Pokemon on top of the pink skies of Kanto. With all of this gathered, I of course have to think to myself, why was this stage even made in the first place? Did it just happen to manifest in Sakurai's dreams? Was someone high that day? I thought about it for a bit and came up with a simple theory. See, the models used for the Pokemon on this stage are actually from both Pokemon Stadium 1 and 2 on the N64, and considering the factors that have been gathered, such as its original name and that there were only 2 Pokemon games released at the time of Melee's release, neither of which have any relation to this stage, I believe this was really made to fill in some quota. This would tie in well with Melee's rush development and a supposed cut Pokemon stage that would have been based on Bellsprout Tower. But hey, that's just a theory. Get the fuck out. So now that we got that over, let's finally talk about the stage itself. And strap yourselves in, because if you thought the look of it is weird, you haven't seen shit yet. At a first glance, when you boot up the stage, you might assume that Poke Floats is an auto-scrolling stage, and I wouldn't blame you for that assumption. However, the camera for this doesn't actually move and stays stationary for the entirety of the match, meaning that Poke Floats isn't an auto-scroller at all. Instead, the floats themselves are moving around the stage, which, while it is amusing to see all of this in action, still doesn't make the overall experience any less weird. You start the stage off on a giant Squirtle, which doesn't last too long as the rest of the stage mainly shows off different platforms in the form of other Pokemon floats, with some having a unique attribute. Whether it's simple like Chikatora, Whopper, and Snorlax, or more complex like Wobbuffet, Goldeen, and Unknown. Regardless of the Pokemon, they all mostly have a unique layout to them with some odd quirks. And when I say odd, yeah, that. Of course, I say mostly, as a few act more like traditional platforms and layout, but I digress. The way these floats move continues to get more and more complex, eventually restarting back to its first cycle, that being Squirtle. This stage is clearly more of a casual, gimmicky stage, and not something to be used in the more serious matches like Yoshi's Story, so there's no way it can ever be considered legal in any capacity. Oh, right. Let's save that for later. I'll be honest, when I first saw this stage, I was more so taken aback on how bizarrely weird it looks. It actually felt like a fever dream just seeing it all the way back in high school. As far as I know, I don't think I ever got a chance to play the stage, but when I eventually did, yeah, it's still weird and feels like I'm experiencing some sort of trip, but that's my experience, and I'll elaborate more on this one a bit later. I believe we've covered everything that there is to discuss surrounding the stage itself, which can only lead into one other section, the responses and opinions the community has for Pokefloats, and let me tell you, it's not exactly consistent. Now, during my research for this video, it's actually kind of weird that I couldn't really find many posts and forums discussing Pokefloats in terms of how people generally feel about the stage. Maybe I should have looked a bit harder into it, probably during editing, but regardless, take everything what I say going forward with a tiny grain of salt because even I'm not sure about the current state of Pokefloats according to the fanbase. So, with it all said, when it comes to the overall reception of Pokefloats, the general consensus for it isn't exactly all cut and dry, with fan discussions relating to it either ranging from positives to negatives. From my general understanding, there seems to be at least two groups in the Pokefloat scale. There is kinda three, but this one's a bit of a stretch. Those that like this stage unironically and praise it for being a unique and fun stage that hasn't been replicated since, and on that same front, there's also those that like it ironically and finds it funny that it even existed at all in the first place. That camp in particular might be a neutral team or might even be part of the next one, which of course are those that flat out dislike Pokefloats for it being an obnoxious stage and sharing similar problems with other auto-scrolling stages, despite it not really being one. To give some credit, I could definitely see all the points for each side, and they are valid pointers at the end of the day, but it's just really interesting that Pokefloats of all stages manages to be more divisive and doesn't really seem to have a general consensus compared to most other stages. With those, you can clearly see a more positive or negative reception for these, even ones that might be divisive to an extent, yet also lean a bit into what people generally see as, oh hey look, this stage is pretty good, and why does this keep getting brought back every single time? With the discussion surrounding Pokefloats being more uncertain as to whether it's good or bad, where do I stand on this front? Do I like Pokefloats? Well, to be honest, I personally found it to be a quite endearing and somewhat enjoyable. This one is definitely a more casual focused stage, I mean no shit, look at it. But I've always been gravitated towards these kind of stages in Smash Bros, sometimes even the quote unquote bad ones, which I may cover at least one of them in a future video. Regardless, I didn't find my time with Pokefloats to be completely awful, but I'm more than aware of its flaws, such as how janky it can be at times, and though this one's a bit minor, I do note that more often than not, I rarely ever get to see the cycle loop once, but I'm more used to this kind of stigma. It's not the best thing I've ever played, and I'd rather play other stages like PictoChat, Minecraft World, or I guess in Melee's case, a stage like Fountain of Dreams, but I did have fun with it, and I can at least commend the developers and to an extent Sakurai for even coming up with this stage to begin with. It's weird, but unique, and I kinda like it. Kinda. But hey, that's at least my general take on Pokefloats. Now, you'd think this is where we move on to our final section, but I do want to bring up one thing that I mentioned earlier in the video. This stage is clearly more of a casual, gimmicky stage, and not something to be used in the more serious matches like Yoshi's Story, so there's no way it can ever be considered legal in any capacity. Oh, right. Yeah, so Pokefloats was once a legal stage in Melee. I'm not joking, this was an actual thing that happened before. The reason as to why it was made legal in the first place might be an immediate question to those that didn't know or were unaware, but apparently the movement on the floats weren't fast enough to cause frequent mobility, on top of the pathing being deterministic. This is the first time I've ever heard that word. I suppose that could be fair-ish, but unsurprisingly, it did eventually get banned from tournament play. As for why it was banned, well, according to the Smash Wiki, quote, "The stage was banned from tournament play due to the possibility of stage spikes and recovery being made difficult by the odd movements and collision detection on some floats." It was also deemed as giving a major advantage to Fox because of how easy it was to time out opponents by stalling and the small vertical blast zones, which Fox's KO moves are oriented around. End quote. So yeah, there you go. Honestly, the sheer fact that a stage like this was considered legal for a time is really funny to me, knowing how jank Pokefloats is in general. And trust me, this isn't the only stage to have this kind of stigma, as there have been other stages in Melee that have similar results. But I'm not going to focus on those, and besides, I don't usually follow competitive Smash stuff too often. I just wanted to briefly mention this bizarre piece of trivia before we move on to the final section of this video. So, let's head there now. Pokefloats is a fascinating stage, one that feels out of the ordinary, yet remains as one of the most interesting stages in the series. We've certainly taken a look at what it has to show, from its mysterious origins and strange gameplay, to the uncertain reputation it's garnered and its short-lived tournament career. It's quite easy to see just how bizarre it all feels and looks. And like I said before, I can see both sides of the coin in regards to how fans generally see Pokefloats. What's funny to me is that the stage has some semblance of an impact following the release of Melee, with some Pokemon media using its English name for things like the Wi-Fi Plus and Pokemon Platinum, Heart Gold, and Soul Silver, and a scene in Detective Pikachu that I can't show or else Paramount might get my ass. Not to mention that, in a way, Pokefloats has garnered a bit of a cult following. Not much, but hey, it's something at the end of the day, and anything is better than nothing. But with all that said, that brings me to the end of this video. It's been quite a long time since I've made a Smash Bros video, and what better way to start making more unique content for this channel than to start with something more familiar. But trust me, I'm not going to convert myself from Mario Kart to Smash Bros. I still have a lot of ideas planned for other things in the future, so stick around for that. But I want to know what you guys think. Do you think Pokefloats is a good stage? Does it suck? What do you think the Omega Pokefloats looks like? Let me know down in the comments below, and remember that Stu cares about you.